The story of the African slave trade is one of history's most painful and complex chapters. It is a story that shaped not only the continent of Africa, but the entire world, leaving deep scars that continue to affect generations today. But how did it all begin? Who were the people involved? And why is it so crucial to understand this history from the perspective of Africa's indigenous communities? Before the transatlantic slave trade became a global phenomenon, Africa was home to diverse societies with rich cultures, thriving economies, and intricate social systems. These communities had their own ways of life, governance, and traditions that had evolved over centuries. The arrival of foreign traders and the rising demand for enslaved people disrupted this balance in ways that were both immediate and long-lasting. This video will take you through the origins of the slave trade in Africa, tracing its roots from local practices to the massive forced migration that followed. We will explore how external forces, internal politics, and economic interests converged to fuel one of history's greatest tragedies. More importantly, we will look closely at how these events affected the indigenous people of Africa, their societies, cultures, and futures. By understanding the beginnings of the slave trade and its devastating impacts, we honor the memories of those who suffered and begin to grasp the resilience and strength of African communities that survived and continue to thrive despite this dark legacy. This journey is not just about history, it's about truth, recognition, and healing. Long before the arrival of European traders, many African societies practiced forms of servitude and slavery. But these systems were often quite different from what would later be imposed by the transatlantic trade. Indigenous forms of slavery were typically rooted in local customs, with roles ranging from domestic service and debt repayment to integration into families and communities. It was not always permanent or hereditary, and enslaved individuals could sometimes gain freedom or social status. In many African cultures, slavery served complex social and economic functions. Captives taken during wars might become part of the victors' households, sometimes assimilated fully. Others were involved in agricultural labor, craftsmanship, or as intermediaries in trade networks. These arrangements were often governed by customs that sought to maintain social harmony and respect human dignity, even within systems of inequality. It is important to understand that these early forms of servitude were embedded within broader community relationships. Enslavement was not solely an economic transaction. It often included responsibilities, protections, and in some cases, pathways for social mobility. The idea of slavery here differed significantly from the brutal, dehumanizing chattel slavery that would later define the transatlantic trade. However, these indigenous practices also had their challenges and injustices. Conflicts over power, resources, and social standing sometimes resulted in exploitation or abuse. Yet, the key distinction lies in their localized, culturally nuanced character, a stark contrast to the large-scale forced migration and commodification that would arrive with European involvement. Understanding these early forms of slavery in Africa is essential to fully grasp the transformations that took place. It shows how a complex system was dramatically altered by external pressures, leading to consequences that would ripple across centuries and continents. The transatlantic slave trade began as European powers expanded their reach across the globe during the Age of Exploration. Seeking labor for plantations and mines in the Americas, Europeans turned to Africa as a source of enslaved people, forever changing the continent's history. This demand created an unprecedented scale and brutality, unlike anything seen before in African servitude practices. Starting in the late 15th century, Portuguese explorers made contact with the coastal African kingdoms, establishing trade relationships that quickly grew to include enslaved people. Over time, other European nations, such as Britain, France, Spain, and the Netherlands, joined the trade, competing fiercely to supply labor for their colonial enterprises. Ships crossed the Atlantic in what became known as the Middle Passage, a horrific journey during which millions were forcibly taken from their homelands. This external demand led to a dramatic expansion of slave trading networks within Africa. Some African rulers and merchants became deeply involved in capturing and selling captives to European traders, driven by new economic incentives and the desire to access European goods like firearms, textiles, and alcohol. The structure and scale of local slavery shifted drastically as more people were forced into servitude for export. The transatlantic trade also intensified conflicts between communities and kingdoms, as raids and wars increased to capture more people to meet European demand. Entire regions experienced demographic shifts, with populations depleted and social systems disrupted. The consequences of this expansion went far beyond economics. It shattered communities, altered political landscapes, and sowed seeds of mistrust that echoed for generations. This period marks a turning point in African history, when indigenous systems were overwhelmed by a vast and ruthless international market. The transatlantic slave trade was not only a business, it was a human tragedy on an unimaginable scale, shaping the continent and the world in ways that still resonate today. The transatlantic slave trade could not have operated on such a massive scale without local involvement. While the system was initiated and driven by European demand, it unfolded through complex partnerships with some African rulers, merchants, and intermediaries. These relationships were shaped by shifting power dynamics, economic pressures, and geopolitical interests, all of which contributed to the deep entanglement of some African kingdoms in the machinery of the slave trade. Some African states and leaders, recognizing the growing demand for enslaved labor, engaged in trade with European merchants in exchange for firearms, goods, and political leverage. These exchanges were often strategic, used to strengthen armies, defend territories, or gain advantage over rival kingdoms. In this context, the trade became a tool for local power building, but at an enormous human cost. Certain regions saw the rise of specialized trading networks in coastal entrepôts, where enslaved individuals were gathered before being sold and shipped across the Atlantic. These hubs became key points in a larger global system. However, the internal cost was severe. As raiding for captives increased, trust between neighboring communities deteriorated, and cycles of violence escalated. Societies were fractured from within as the incentive for trade outweighed long-standing communal bonds. It's essential to note that participation varied widely across the continent. Not all African kingdoms were involved, and many resisted the trade or suffered greatly from it without ever engaging directly. Furthermore, the imbalance in technological power and the influence of European ships and weaponry meant that local actors often operated under unequal conditions. Many leaders did not foresee the long-term consequences of their choices, nor the scale of the devastation to come. Ultimately, while some African groups gained short-term economic or political advantage, the legacy was devastating. The very societies that engaged in the trade were often weakened by it. As millions were taken, the human and cultural loss was irreplaceable. The continent was left with broken lineages, lost knowledge, and a historical wound that continues to call for reckoning and reflection. The human cost of the transatlantic slave trade goes far beyond the sheer number of lives uprooted and transported across oceans. The trade tore apart families, dismantled social structures, and inflicted wounds on the very fabric of African societies that have taken centuries to heal. The social and cultural impacts were profound and lasting. Communities lost significant portions of their populations, often the young and able-bodied, creating demographic imbalances that affected growth and stability. The absence of so many people not only disrupted daily life, but also weakened social cohesion, as extended families and clans were fractured. In many regions, this loss slowed population growth and altered the traditional roles of men and women in society. Culturally, the slave trade caused a rupture in the transmission of traditions, languages, and spiritual practices. Elders, storytellers, and cultural leaders were among those lost, interrupting the passing down of knowledge that defined identity and community cohesion. The forced removal of people also meant that many cultural practices were carried away and transformed in distant lands, leaving a void in their places of origin. Additionally, the constant threat of raids and warfare to capture individuals for trade created an atmosphere of fear and instability. Trust between neighboring communities eroded, and political alliances shifted in response to the pressures of the trade. These tensions made it difficult for societies to maintain their previous levels of cooperation, trade, and peace. The psychological toll of these disruptions was immense. Generations grew up with trauma and loss, affecting how communities saw themselves and their futures. While many African societies showed remarkable resilience, rebuilding social ties and cultural traditions, the deep scars left by the slave trade continue to influence African life today. The transatlantic slave trade reshaped African economies in profound and often destructive ways. While some individuals and groups gained wealth and goods from participating in the trade, the broader economic impact on indigenous communities was devastating, contributing to long-term underdevelopment and instability. One of the most significant effects was the disruption of traditional economies. Many regions lost large portions of their labor force, weakening agricultural production and craft industries that were essential to local prosperity. With people forcibly removed, communities struggled to sustain food production, trade, and the social systems that supported economic activity. The slave trade also introduced new economic dependencies. As African leaders and merchants exchanged captives for European goods, including firearms, textiles, and alcohol, local economies became increasingly tied to foreign markets and interests. This shift often undermined traditional economic autonomy and fostered unequal power dynamics both within and between communities. Moreover, the focus on capturing and trading people sometimes replaced investment in other economic activities. The relentless pursuit of captives encouraged warfare and raiding, diverting energy and resources from development to conflict. This cycle of violence further destabilized regions and hindered economic growth. The legacy of the slave trade's economic impact is still evident today. Many African countries face significant obstacles during and after colonialism as they work to rebuild their economies amid the lasting effects of population loss, disrupted trade networks, and social fragmentation. Understanding this legacy is crucial to addressing ongoing challenges related to poverty, inequality, and development. Recognizing the economic consequences of the slave trade also highlights the resilience and ingenuity of African communities. Despite centuries of disruption, many have rebuilt, adapted, and thrived, contributing richly to global culture, innovation, and economy. Their stories are not only about loss, but also about strength and survival. The story of the African slave trade is a painful chapter, one marked by loss, disruption, and profound human suffering. But it is also a story of resilience, courage, and survival. By remembering the origins and impacts of this trade, we honor those who were lost and recognize the strength of the indigenous communities that endured. Understanding this history is essential for healing, for building a future where the truths of the past are acknowledged and where the dignity of all people is respected. It reminds us that history is not just about dates and events, but about people and the legacies they leave behind. As we reflect on these realities, it's vital to keep this conversation alive. Sharing knowledge about the crimes committed against Africa and its peoples helps ensure that these lessons are never forgotten and that future generations grow with awareness and respect for their heritage. If this video brought you insight and perspective, please like, share, and subscribe. By doing so, you help keep the world informed and support the ongoing journey toward understanding, justice, and healing for Africa and its indigenous peoples.